A very warm welcome to today's edition of our learning tutorial. I'm Kwachi Jonathan Boache, JK of JK Clothing. Today we're going to learn how to draft the basic bodice for the female. We are drafting the front, the back, and the sleeve. After we're done with that, we would also use this to sew this very simple style you see here. We have done this basic bodice in tree before, but then our friends in the diaspora do not have the opportunity of watching and understanding. That is the main reason why we've done this today. If you'd want to learn how to do this, do stick and stay. Let's do this together. Okay, so before we start drafting our pattern, we first need to have our measurement. And so that is the measurement you see displayed on the screen. Okay, we go ahead. We'd draw a line to represent the starting line. Let's bear in mind that this very line you see here is our center front line. We are drafting the front pattern first, and then we'll go ahead to draft the back pattern. And so this is our starting line. It is made perpendicular to the center front line. Next step would be to measure our shoulder to shoulder measurement or the back measurement. In this instance, the back measurement is 14 and a half. When we divide 14 and a half by 2, we get 7 and a quarter. You then add your seam allowance to it. My seam allowance is quarter of an inch. And so 7 and quarter plus quarter of an inch would give me 7 and a half. We then measure the 7 and a half from this center front point towards this level. The next step would be to measure our shoulder slope. The shoulder slope was not measured on the body, but then we have the normal shoulder slope. That is for the client whose shoulder slope you don't see going up too much or being way too low. You can use 1.5 for such a person. If the person's shoulder slopes a bit deeper, you would use 1.75 or 2 inches. And if the person's shoulder rises up, that is if the shoulder slopes very shallowly, then you would do 1 inch or 1.25. And so with this, because we assume it's a normal shoulder slope, we are doing 1.5. The next step will be to measure our neck width, which is taken from here to here. So our neck width is 3 inches. After that, we connect our neck width to our shoulder slope. The next step is to measure your shoulder to nipple measurement and then make a mark. Shoulder to nipple in this instance is 10 and a half. And so this would have been 10 and a half. But then because we would join the shoulder, that is the front and then the back pattern will be joined at the shoulder, we'll add our seam allowance of quarter to it. And so we have, instead of the 10 and a half, we have 10 and 3/4. After this, we would as well measure our shoulder to underbust, shoulder to waist measurement. So our shoulder to underbust is 13 and a half, shoulder to waist is 17 and a half. And so we'll do that. We bear in mind to add our quarter of an inch to it. That is for the seam of the shoulder. And so the 13 and a half will give us 13 and 3/4. And the 17 and a half will give us 17 and 3/4. So we can square these off. The next step would be to mark our nipple to nipple measurement, or the tip to tip, or the bust point interval. And so In this instance, the bust point to bust point is 7 inches. We divide it into 2, and then we have 3.5. So this is 3.5. We mark the same 3.5 on the waistline. After we are done with this, we can join the line from the waist to the bust point. Next, we would want to draw our shoulder dart. How do we do this? We divide our shoulder length into 2 to determine the midpoint. In this instance, we are getting 4.75. We divide that into 2, and we have 2.38. After we are done with this, we would measure 1 inch above the shoulder to nipple point. Bear in mind, this is not the same for everybody, but then it takes a certain range. If the person's bust is 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, you can go 1 inch above the shoulder to nipple point. If the person's bust is above 39, if it's above 40 to about 43, you would go 1.5 inches. If it's above that, you would go 2 inches. That is above the bust point. All this is to create space for the breast to be, accommodated in there. The next step would be to hold our shoulder dart. The shoulder dart also goes in a range. And so if the person's bust is 34, is 30, let's say the person's bust is 29, 30, all the way to about 33, you would do just about 2.5 inches of the shoulder dart. If the bust is about 34 to 40, you do 2.75. If the person's bust is about 40 upwards, you do 3 inches of the shoulder dart. And so we are doing 2.75 because the bust is 34. And so we divide 34 into 2. We divide 2.75 into 2, and would have 1.38, 1.38 on both sides of the shoulder midpoint, the shoulder length midpoint that we have here. So this is 1.38, and this is 1.38 on the other side. After this is done, we'll join both lines to where the shoulder dart is supposed to end. That is a 1 inch above the bust point. Next, we would fold this dart onto the other dart. You'd see that this shoulder slope, which was starting from the neck depth all the way to the shoulder slope at this point, when it is folded on, that line gets truncated along the way. And so what you do is that you would straighten up the one you had at the top here, ignoring the one down here. And so we would continue this line and extend it further. Meaning we are discarding this very first line we drew. We would measure the shoulder to shoulder or the back measurement again so that we don't fall short because of the dart that we have folded here. And so the whole shoulder to shoulder was 14.5. We divided by 2, we had 7.25. We added our seam allowance of 1/4 inch to it, and then we had 7.5. So we mark the 7.5 all over again. Next, we can open this and then continue. Once we have our shoulder point here, we will then find our arm depth. The arm depth measurement is determined by using our bicep measurement divided by 2. And so our bicep was 13 inches. When we divide it by 2, we have 6.5. With a 6.5, you can either leave it at 6.5, or you may decide to add an inch of an ease to it. It all depends on how wide you want your armhole to be. And so you may decide to do the 6.5, which is the exact bicep divided by 2, or you may add your 1 inch ease to it to make it 7.5. Or you may even decide to do half an inch ease. It all depends on how wide you want your armhole to be. In this instance, we are using a half inch ease, and so the half inch ease plus the 6.5 would give us 7 inches, and so we mark 7 inches. On the chest line, we would divide our bust measurement by 4, and so the bust is 34 divided by 4 gives us 8.5. Plus our seam allowance. If you do 1 inch seam allowance, you can add it. If you do 2 inches, you can add it. It is not specific. We are to determine and then mark our armhole. To be able to do that, we divide our arm depth into 3, and then we take 1/3 of it from the chest line upwards. And so 7 inches was the arm depth we had. Divided by 3 will give us 2 3/8. And so this is 2 3/8. On this line, we are to measure our across chest measurement because this is the front pattern we are drafting. And so our cross chest is 12.5. Divided by 2 would give us 6.25. This is 6.25. We would then add the allowance that this dart will take away from the across chest. Measuring this, we have 3/4. And so we add 3/4 to what we had. And then the next step would be to add our seam allowance, just as we added to the shoulder to shoulder. And so if you added half of an inch to the shoulder to shoulder or the back measurement, it means here you'll be adding the same thing. I added 1/4 of an inch at this point, and so I'll be adding 1/4 of an inch at the across chest measurement too. And so this is it. Now we are to join a line from the apex of the shoulder to where the across chest measurement was to the bust divided by 4, not the seam allowance we added. We do that using our French curve. And so you tilt the French curve till it touches all the 3 points, 1, 2, 3. If you do not have a French curve, you also have the option of using your free hand to plot to join the various plots. So this is our armhole. The next step would be to go and then add our various horizontal measurements divided by 4 plus our seam allowance to it. And so this is the bust, the highest part of the bust. And so our bust is 34 divided by 4 gives us 8.5. Plus our seam allowance, 1 inch. The next step is to go for our underbust. The underbust is 26. 26 divided by 4 gives us 6.5. This is 6.5 plus the amount of dart you'd want to take from your underbust. And so if you'd want to take 1 inch, you'd add the 1 inch to it. If you'd want to do 2 inches, you add the 2 inches to it. Bear in mind, the higher you make your dart, that is at the underbust, the bigger you create volume for the breast. And so we are doing 2 inches for this. You can do 1 inch and it would be fine. So we've added our dart interval to it. We're also going to add our seam allowance of 1 inch. After we're done with this, we go to the waist. The waist is 24 divided by 4 gives us 6. We would as well add 2 inches for the dart and then add 1 inch for the seam allowance. With this done, we can join these points. We would then come and take off our dart. So we said the dart we're taking at the underbust was 2 inches. And so this being the midpoint, we'll do 1 inch on both sides. We'll do same for the waistline. We are then to connect from the waist to the underbust and to the bust. With this, we are done with the front. If you'd want to take your neck hole too, then you would measure from the starting point line to about 4 inches. That gives us the neck depth. That is how deep the neck line is. So we square this off and square that off as well. With this, we can give it the shape of a neckline. This is the middle line. So after this line, we would join a line to this point. We will draw a line from here all the way to meet the midpoint of the dart. Okay, so this is the chest line, this is the bust line, this is the underbust line, and then this is the waist line. There's another thing that I would want us to avert our minds to when it comes to the shaping and this type of dart. Sometimes you'd want to sew a dress and then you want the bust to, protrude or to come up. If you want to do that, that is when you hold this dart at the underbust line and then you extend the same thing to the waistline in a straight line. If we did not want that and then we wanted to conceal the bust, that is to not make people notice that the bust, comes up that much. What you would do would be to join a line from the bust point here all the way to the waist without having to open it at the underbust. And so in that instance, this is what you would do. And so this is what we would do. And then we'll draw a straight line. So this would have been it. That is, if you don't want the dress to show much of a protruded bust, this is what you do. You take the widest dart measurement from the waist, and then it comes all the way to the bust point. You only do this if you want the breast to appear as protruding. That is when you do this. Other than that, we do the blue line. Okay, so now we're done with the front. We're going to draft our back pattern. With the back pattern, what you do is that you will extend the chest line, the waist line. And so we need to draw a line to serve as the center back line. Okay, so with this, what you would measure here would be the bust measurement divided by 4. So the bust is 34 divided by 4 gives us 8.5. 1 inch seam allowance was added to the front, so we'll add the same thing to the back. When we get here, the waist was 24. 24 divided by 4 gives us 6. We'll add our dart allowance, which is 1.5 at the back. It is 1.5. So this is 1.5. And we'll then add our seam allowance of 1 inch. Now we can draw a line to join the waist to the chest line. Measure our arm depth measurement from the chest line upwards and mark. And then we'll add our shoulder slope to it. And so the arm depth was 7. Taking it from the front, it was 7. So we bring 7 here. And the shoulder slope was 1.5. Now we can square the two off. Our neck width for the front was 3 inches. So we'd mark 3 inches for the back as well. Our shoulder to shoulder was 14.5. We added our seam allowance to the 14.5 divided by 2, and we had 7.5. We start from here and then we end on the shoulder slope line. We then join the neck width to the shoulder slope. After this, we'll divide the arm depth into 3. The arm depth is 7 divided by 3 will give us 238. Then we would measure our across back measurement. Across back is 13.5 divided by 2 gives us 6.75. We will then add our 1/4 inch, which was added to the shoulder to shoulder measurement. With this, with a French curve, we can join the point from the shoulder slope to the across back measurement to the chest line divided by 4. The next step would be to draw our neck hole. For the basic bodice, we'll take just 1 inch down from the starting point line. With this squared, we'll draw our neck hole. So to mark our dart line for the back pattern, what you do is that the nipple to nipple measurement you used for the front, you'd do the same thing for the back, but then you'd add 1/4 inch to it. This is standard. And so nipple to nipple was 7 divided by 2 gave us 3.5. We take it to the back and then we have 3.75. We mark the same thing on the waistline. The dart allowance we added to the waist was 1.5. And so this being the midpoint, we'll do 3/4 on both sides. And join each of them to this point. Next step would be to mark our nape to waist. We would have been done with the back, but the nape to waist measurement was 14 and a half. So the 14 and a half will start from the nape. This is 14 and a half. But then because we'll be sewing quarter of an inch, we would then add the quarter to make it 14 3/4. Then we would fold this dart onto the next dart, and after that we will draw a curve which would end at where the seam allowance ended. Okay, so once we are done with the front and then the back pattern, we'll go ahead and cut them. So this is how our basic bodice looks like. You can click on the link to watch the video on the sleeve. You can as well click on the link to watch our video on how we sewed the basic bodice. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, comment, share. Thank you.